I still remember the day. My world cracked open without warning. It was a bright Saturday in suburban Ohio, the kind of morning that makes you believe nothing bad could ever stay for long. The sky was a soft blue, the air smelled like freshly cut grass, and my son, my little boy, was laughing on the swings like the world belonged only to him. I stood a few feet away, holding my coffee in both hands, watching him push his tiny legs forward and backward, his hair bouncing with every swing. That sound, his laughter, used to be my peace, my reason, my everything. I had built my life around him after everything started falling apart with his father. Back then, I didn't know that even peace can become a memory you're not allowed to keep for long. His name was Ethan. My son, 8 years old, full of questions, full of light. He believed his father was just busy with work, like I had carefully trained myself to say. Because the truth was heavier than I could explain to a child. My husband, Daniel, had slowly become a stranger long before I ever admitted it to myself. It didn't happen overnight. That's what makes betrayal so cruel. It arrives in small changes, late nights that become normal, phone calls that stop being shared, smiles that no longer reach the eyes, conversations that turn into silence even when you're sitting right next to each other. We used to be a simple American family with simple dreams. A small house with a white fence, weekend barbecues, and plans we made while lying in bed, thinking life would always stay soft around the edges. But life doesn't promise softness. It tests how much you can survive when everything hardens. I still remember the first time I felt something was wrong. It was nothing dramatic, just a moment. He came home late that night, the scent of perfume unfamiliar on his shirt. Not mine, not anyone I knew. When I asked him, he laughed it off. Said it was from a coworker who hugged too close at a celebration. I wanted to believe him. I really did, because believing is easier than breaking. So I believed him. And slowly, I stopped asking questions. That is how women survive sometimes, by shrinking their doubts until they fit quietly inside them. But standing there in the park that day, watching Ethan swing higher and higher, I didn't know I was about to see everything I had been avoiding come alive in front of my eyes. It started with movement in the distance. A couple walking slowly along the path near the playground. At first, I didn't pay attention. There were always families there on weekends. Mothers, fathers, children. Normal life happening in fragments all around me. But then something inside me went still. It was the way he laughed. A familiar laugh. Not the one I heard at home anymore, but the one I used to know. The one I used to fall asleep listening to when everything was still good. My eyes lifted before I even understood why. And there he was. Daniel. Walking beside a woman I had never seen before. Her hand resting lightly on his arm like it belonged there. They were not in a rush, not hiding, not looking over their shoulders. They walked like people who had forgotten the world could see them. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Ethan called out to me from the swings, "Mom, watch me go high." But I couldn't answer him. My eyes were locked on them. The woman laughed at something he said, tilting her head slightly toward him, and he smiled back in a way I hadn't seen in years. Not at me, not at home, not even at our son. Something inside me cracked, quietly but completely. It wasn't rage at first. It was disbelief. Because the mind always tries to protect you before the heart gives in. Maybe it's not him. Maybe I'm mistaken, maybe. But then he stopped walking, right near the edge of the playground. And his eyes shifted. Not toward me. Not at first. Toward Ethan. Our son. He smiled, that same distant smile, like he was watching something that belonged to another life. For a second, I thought maybe he would wave. Maybe he would come over. Maybe there was still a version of him that remembered what we were. But then the woman touched his arm again. And his attention went back to her. Just like that. Like we were nothing. Like Ethan and I were just part of a world he had already stepped out of. My grip tightened around my coffee cup until it hurt. Ethan was still laughing on the swings, completely unaware that his father was standing just a few yards away, building a life that no longer included us. I don't know how long I stood there. Seconds felt like years. I remember the sound of children playing, the wind moving through trees, the distant bark of a dog, and inside me, everything going silent at once. Then Daniel and the woman turned slightly, continuing their walk. Away from the playground. Away from us. And that's when Ethan looked at me again. "Mom," he called, slowing his swing. "Why are you looking like that?" I forced my lips into something that resembled a smile. Because mothers learn how to hide storms behind their faces. "Nothing, baby," I said softly. "Just keep swinging." But inside me, nothing was the same anymore. Because I had just seen the moment my marriage stopped pretending. And I knew, without anyone telling me, that this was only the beginning of something I would never be able to unsee. And as I watched my son swing back and forth under the same sky that had just betrayed me, I realized one terrifying truth. Some heartbreaks don't come crashing. They arrive quietly. While your child is laughing, I walked Ethan home that day like nothing had happened. That was the first skill I learned as everything inside me started collapsing. How to act normal when your entire world has split open quietly in your chest. He kept talking the whole way back, swinging his small backpack, telling me about a game he played at school, about how his friend Jake had fallen during recess and everyone laughed, about how he wanted pizza for dinner. I answered at the right moments, smiled at the right lines, nodded like a mother should. But my mind wasn't there. It was still at the playground. Still watching Daniel walk away with that woman, like I was nothing more than background noise in a life he had already rewritten. When we got home, Ethan ran inside first, kicking off his shoes and shouting for juice. The sound of him being a child again filled the house, bouncing off walls that suddenly felt too quiet for what I was carrying inside me. I stood at the door for a moment, longer than I should have. My hand stayed on the knob. Because part of me wanted to turn around, to go back, to find him, to demand answers in the middle of that perfect Saturday afternoon light that had no idea what it had just witnessed. But another part of me already knew something deeper. If I chased him now, I would not be chasing truth. I would be chasing the last illusion I had left. So I closed the door and walked inside. That night, I barely remember cooking dinner. Ethan ate in front of the television, completely unaware that his mother's hands were shaking as she poured milk into a glass. I kept thinking about the way Daniel smiled. Not the smile of a man who had slipped once, but the smile of someone comfortable in two worlds. That thought hurt more than anything else. Because betrayal isn't only about what someone does. It's about how long they were capable of doing it without you noticing. After Ethan fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room. The house felt different now. Same furniture, same photos on the wall, same quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But everything felt like it belonged to a story I was no longer part of. I picked up my phone. My fingers hovered over Daniel's name. We hadn't spoken much that day. He had sent a message in the morning saying he would be busy with work stuff. That phrase now felt like a joke I wasn't in on. I didn't call him. Not yet. Instead, I did something I never thought I would do. I opened his social media. At first, there was nothing obvious. Normal posts, work-related updates, old family photos from years ago when things still looked real. But then I noticed it. A recent photo, posted just 2 days ago. It wasn't with me. It wasn't with Ethan. It was him. And her. The same woman. Standing outside a restaurant I didn't recognize, her hand resting on his chest, both of them smiling like life had given them something easy and kind. My stomach turned. I stared at the image longer than I should have, as if staring hard enough could turn it into something else. But it didn't change. Reality rarely does. I closed the phone and leaned back on the couch. For a long time, I didn't cry. That surprised me. People think heartbreak arrives as tears, but real heartbreak often arrives as silence first. A strange numbness, where your body refuses to catch up with what your mind already knows. I sat there until the house became completely still. Then I heard it. A key in the front door. My heart reacted before my mind did. Daniel walked in like it was just another day. Jacket over his arm, hair slightly messy like he had been running around meetings all day. The same casual, tired expression he always wore when he came home late. "Hey," he said, like nothing had shifted in the universe. I looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time, I saw him clearly. Not the version I had built in my head. Not the father of my child. But a man who could walk into a home he no longer emotionally lived in and still pretend it was his. "Where were you today?" I asked quietly. He didn't look up right away. He placed his keys on the counter, loosened his watch. "Work," he said simply. That word again. Work. A shield that had started to feel too thin to hide anything anymore. I stood up slowly. My voice didn't shake, even though everything inside me did. "I was at the park today," I said. That made him pause. Just for a second. But I saw it. That flicker. The smallest hesitation. "What park?" he asked, still not meeting my eyes fully. "The one near Ethan's school," I said. Silence stretched between us. I could hear the refrigerator hum again. The faint sound of Ethan shifting in his sleep upstairs. The distant ticking of a clock that suddenly felt too loud. Then I said it. "I saw you." That was the moment everything changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. Like a door locking. He finally looked at me. And I saw something I had never seen before in his eyes. Not fear. Not guilt. Something more dangerous. Acceptance. Like he had been waiting for this moment longer than I had. "You were with someone," I continued. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his hand across his face like he was tired, not of the situation, but of pretending it wasn't real. "Anna," he said finally. One name. That's all it took. No explanation, no build-up, no attempt to deny it anymore. Just a name. Like it was the most normal thing in the world. I felt my throat tighten. "And what am I supposed to do with that?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. Not angry. Not defensive. Just distant. "I didn't plan for things to go like this," he said. That sentence. That one sentence. People use it when they want distance from their own choices. Like life just happened to them instead of through them. I laughed once. Not because it was funny. Because if I didn't, I would break in front of him. "Things do go like this, Daniel," I said softly. "People choose." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked away toward the window. Outside, the streetlights had started to glow. Somewhere in the house, our son slept believing the world was still intact. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said. That was worse. Because it meant he knew he already had. And continued anyway. I stepped closer. My voice lowered. "How long?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. That silence told me more than words ever could. "Almost a year," he finally said. A year. My mind repeated it like it couldn't understand the scale of it. A year of lies. A year of returning home after being with someone else. A year of sitting across from me at dinner tables, talking about our child, our future, our life, while already building another one in secret. My hands went cold. "I saw you with him," I said quietly. He frowned slightly. "Ethan?" he asked. I shook my head. "The park," I said again. "He saw you too." Something shifted in his expression then. Not guilt. Something closer to concern. "Does he know?" he asked quickly. That question hit me harder than anything else. Not because he cared about what he had done to me, but because he feared what it might mean for how he would be seen by his son. I didn't tell him, I said. His shoulders relaxed slightly. But mine didn't. Because in that moment, I understood something painfully clear. He wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of being seen clearly. And that is a different kind of selfishness. One that builds entire lives around hiding. I walked past him slowly, heading toward the stairs. He didn't stop me. Didn't follow. Just stood there in the kitchen, like a man waiting for a storm to pass without realizing he was the one who created it. Before I went upstairs, I stopped. Not turning back. Just speaking into the space between us. I don't know who you are anymore, I said. Then I walked away. And for the first time that day, I let myself feel it. Not just shock. Not just disbelief. But the beginning of something heavier. Grief. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't discovering betrayal. It's realizing you've been living beside it long enough to call it love. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Daniel slept beside me like nothing inside our lives had shifted. His breathing was steady, almost peaceful, the kind of sleep that belongs to someone who has already detached himself from guilt long before the conversation ever happened. I kept thinking about that name. Anna. It wasn't just a person. It was proof. Proof that my instincts hadn't been paranoia. Proof that the late nights, the distance, the coldness, all of it had a face now. And worse than that, it had duration, almost a year. A year of my life that had been shared without my knowledge. At some point, I turned my head and looked at him. Really looked. He looked like the same man I married. The same jawline, the same familiar shape of his hands resting loosely on the blanket. But he wasn't the same. Or maybe he had been changing for so long that I just stopped noticing. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, the room was already pale with morning light. Daniel was gone. No note. No goodbye. Just empty space on his side of the bed, like a silent continuation of everything he had already started leaving behind. I sat up slowly. My body felt heavy, like it was still carrying the weight of everything I had learned the night before. Downstairs, the house was quiet. Ethan was still asleep. For a moment, I stood in the hallway outside his room, just listening to him breathe. That was the only sound that still felt honest. When I finally went into the kitchen, I saw Daniel's mug in the sink. Half filled with coffee he hadn't finished. Normal things. Ordinary details that suddenly felt insulting in their simplicity. Like life was pretending nothing had broken. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes. I had two choices now. One was to collapse into it. To confront him again. To demand explanations that would never feel like enough. To let myself drown in questions that had no answers that could fix anything. The other was harder. To step outside of it. To stop reacting and start observing. Because something in me knew that if I stayed in emotional shock, I would lose more than just my marriage. I would lose my clarity. And I couldn't afford that. Not anymore. Ethan came down the stairs, rubbing his eyes a little while later. "Mom," he said sleepily, "what's for breakfast?" That question hit me harder than it should have. Because it reminded me that life still needed to continue around the damage. "Pancakes," I said gently, forcing a smile. He nodded happily and went to sit at the table like nothing in the world had changed for him yet. And I realized something else in that moment. Children don't see cracks unless adults show them. So I wouldn't show him. Not yet. The morning passed in quiet routines. School lunch packed, shoes found, backpack zipped, Ethan talking about a science project he didn't realize I was barely hearing. I dropped him off at school and watched him walk through the doors. Only when he disappeared inside did I allow myself to exhale fully. And then I sat in the car. Still parked, not moving, because I knew I couldn't stay like this. I couldn't live in a house where I was the only one still pretending. So I did the first thing that felt like control. I started gathering information, not emotional reactions. Vax. That afternoon, while Ethan was at school, I went back home and opened Daniel's laptop. It wasn't locked. That alone told me more than I wanted to admit. People who have nothing to hide don't leave doors open. I sat at the kitchen table and began scrolling. Emails first, then calendar, then messages. At first, everything looked normal. Work meetings, project updates, client discussions. And then I saw her name again. Anna. It was hidden in threads that didn't look suspicious at first glance. Conversations framed as follow-ups and logistics. But when I read deeper, the tone changed. Inside jokes. Plans that extended beyond work hours. Small details that didn't belong in professional language. A restaurant reservation. A hotel receipt. My hands went still. There it was. Clear. Undeniable. A pattern. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the screen without blinking. A year. Not an accident. Not confusion. A structured double life. And then something unexpected happened inside me. The crying didn't come. Not yet. Instead, something colder settled in. A kind of quiet awareness. Because once you see structure and betrayal, it stops feeling like chaos. It becomes something worse. A decision someone has maintained. I closed the laptop. Slowly. Carefully. Like I was putting a lid on something dangerous. Then I sat there for a long time, just listening to the silence of the house. I wasn't thinking about revenge. Or anger. I was thinking about Ethan. Because whatever I did next would not just affect me. It would shape how his world broke, or didn't break. That evening, Daniel came home later than usual. This time, I didn't ask where he had been. He walked in like the previous night hadn't happened. Like confession had been a temporary inconvenience rather than a fracture. Ethan ran to him immediately. Dad. That word. Dad. It hit differently now. Daniel crouched down and hugged him, smiling easily. Too easily. And I watched. Not from pain this time. From distance. Because I needed to see how he behaved when he thought everything was still salvageable. Later, after Ethan went upstairs, Daniel finally looked at me. About last night, he started. I cut him off. I'm not doing that again, I said calmly. He frowned slightly. Doing what? Revisiting the same conversation where you explain your second life in soft sentences, I replied. Silence. He exhaled slowly. I didn't want it to go this far, he said again. That phrase. Again. I looked at him. You keep saying that, I said, but you still went there. He didn't respond. Because there was nothing useful left to say. And I realized something important. He wasn't going to end it easily. People who maintain double lives don't let them collapse just because they were discovered. They try to manage both worlds. That meant I wasn't just dealing with betrayal. I was dealing with someone trying to keep it functional. And I had to decide if I was going to allow that. The next morning, I made a decision. I called a lawyer. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. Sitting in my car outside a grocery store parking lot like it was the most normal thing in the world. My voice didn't shake when I explained my situation. It surprised me, because I expected to fall apart. But I didn't. The lawyer asked practical questions. Assets, income, living situation, child custody. Each answer made the situation more real, more structured, less emotional. And that helped. because emotions were what had kept me frozen. After the call, I sat in the car for a long time, watching people walk in and out of stores with groceries and normal lives. And I wondered how many of them were carrying invisible endings inside their marriages. I went home before Ethan returned from school. Daniel was already there, sitting at the table, waiting, like he knew something had shifted again. "I got a call today," I said. He looked up. From the tone of my voice, he understood it wasn't about feelings anymore. It was about consequences. And for the first time since this began, I saw something in him change. Not guilt, not sadness, awareness. Because now the situation had moved beyond secrecy. It had entered structure. And structure meant he could no longer control the narrative alone. "I'm not doing this blindly anymore," I said quietly. He stared at me for a long moment, then leaned back slightly. "You're going to make this worse," he said. That was the moment I realized something else. He still believed he had influence over the outcome. Even now. Even after everything. And that told me exactly what kind of man I was dealing with. Not just someone who betrayed trust, but someone who expected the world to adjust around his choices. I stood up slowly. "No," I said, "you already did that." Then I walked away. Upstairs, I found Ethan in his room building something out of blocks. He looked up and smiled. "Mom, look." And in that moment, I made another decision. Whatever happened between adults, I would not let it destroy his sense of safety more than necessary. Because he didn't deserve the weight of what adults break when they forget children are watching. I sat down beside him. And for the first time in days, I focused only on him. But even while I smiled and listened and nodded, I knew something irreversible had already begun. Not just the end of a marriage, but the beginning of rebuilding a life from what was left behind. That week passed in a strange rhythm, like life was pretending to be normal while everything underneath it was already shifting. I woke up every morning before everyone else. Not because I wanted to. Because my mind refused to rest in the same house where everything had started to split apart. Daniel and I moved around each other like careful strangers. Not fighting. Not talking. Just existing in the same space, with invisible walls between us. Ethan didn't notice much. Children rarely notice endings until they are forced to name them. He still laughed at breakfast, still complained about homework, still asked if we could go to the park again on Saturday. And every time he did, something inside me tightened. Because the park was no longer just a park. It was the place where my life stopped pretending. Daniel left earlier each morning. He stopped explaining where he was going. And I stopped asking. Because I already knew the answers were not meant for me anymore. But what I didn't know yet was that silence has its own consequences. It doesn't end problems. It just moves them underground. One afternoon, I got a call from Ethan's school. At first, I thought it was routine. A missing lunch form, a permission slip, something normal. But the voice on the other end was careful. "Mrs. Carter, could you come in today?" That sentence alone changed the air in my lungs. I drove there within 20 minutes. Fast, silent, focused. The school building looked the same as always. Bright walls, children's drawings, the smell of crayons and disinfectant that every American school seems to share. But the moment I stepped into the office, I knew something was off. The principal was waiting, and Ethan's teacher stood beside her. My heart dropped slightly, but I held my face steady. "Is Ethan okay?" I asked immediately. The teacher nodded quickly. "Yes, he's physically fine," she said, "but there was an incident." That word, incident, it always sounds smaller than it is. They told me he had gotten into a small argument during recess. Another child had said something. About his parents. My chest tightened. What exactly was said? I asked. The principal hesitated, then spoke carefully. He mentioned that his father doesn't live at home anymore, and another student repeated something they overheard. I didn't need more detail. Children don't invent cruelty. They repeat what they hear. And somewhere, somehow, adult life had leaked into his world. My hands went cold. Where is he? I asked quietly. In counseling room, the teacher said. I walked down the hallway like I was moving through water, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the room, I paused for a second outside the door. Because I wasn't just about to see my son. I was about to see the first visible crack in his understanding of his family. I opened the door slowly. Ethan was sitting on a small chair, legs swinging slightly, eyes red but trying not to cry. When he saw me, his face changed instantly. "Mom," he said quietly. And that one word almost broke me. I walked over and knelt in front of him. "Hey," I said softly, "I'm here." He looked down at his hands. "They said Dad doesn't live with us," he whispered. Silence filled the room. The counselor stepped back slightly, giving us space. I took a breath. Careful. Because this was the moment that would define how he understood everything later. "Ethan," I said gently, "come here." He moved closer. I held his hands. And I chose honesty, but in a way that wouldn't destroy him. "Sometimes adults go through things they don't handle the right way," I said. "And sometimes they make mistakes that affect families." His eyes lifted slightly. "Is Dad mad at us?" he asked. That question hit deeper than anything else so far. Because children never assume abandonment first. They assume fault. I shook my head quickly. "No," I said firmly. "This is not your fault, not even a little bit." He blinked slowly. "But then why?" I paused. And for the first time, I had to simplify a truth that was too complicated for his age. "Grown-up problems," I said. "Between me and your dad, not you." He stayed quiet, then leaned forward and hugged me. Small arms. Heavy silence. And I held him longer than usual. Because I knew something had shifted in him now. Even if he didn't fully understand it yet. On the drive home, he didn't talk much. Just looked out the window. That scared me more than crying would have. Because silence in children is how confusion grows. When we got home, Daniel was already there. Sitting on the couch. Waiting. Like he had been informed. And I immediately understood something else. This school incident wasn't just a random moment. It had already traveled. Information always moves faster than people expect. Ethan walked past him without speaking and went upstairs. Daniel watched him go. Then looked at me. "What happened?" he asked. I didn't sit down. "I had to explain things at his school," I said. His expression tightened slightly. "What did you tell them?" That question told me everything. He wasn't focused on Ethan. He was focused on control. I kept my voice calm. "I told them the truth they needed," I said. "Not yours, not mine, theirs." He exhaled slowly. "This is exactly what I meant," he said. "Things are getting messy." That word. Messy. As if this was something accidental. As if two parallel lives collapsing into each other was just inconvenience. I looked at him. "You don't get to describe this like it's weather," I said quietly. He stood up slightly. "I'm trying to manage this situation," he said. That made me laugh once. Sharp, controlled. "Manage," I repeated. "You've been managing two families." That landed. I could see it. For a moment, something in his expression shifted again. But not enough to break him. Just enough to show me he still believed he had options. That evening, after Ethan went to bed early, Daniel came into the kitchen where I was sitting. For the first time in days, he didn't try to act normal. He just spoke. I ended things with her, he said. I looked up slowly. And, I asked. He hesitated. That hesitation told me more than the sentence itself. I told her it's over, he added. I leaned back slightly. Not surprised. Not relieved. Just aware. Because ending one part of a double life doesn't erase the existence of it. You think that fixes this? I asked quietly. He frowned. I'm trying to fix it, he said. That word again. Fix. As if broken trust could be repaired like a broken object. I stood up slowly. No, I said. You're trying to reduce damage control to something you can finish quickly. He stepped closer. What do you want from me then? He asked. That was the first time he sounded tired. Not strategic. Just tired. I looked at him for a long moment. And I realized something important. I didn't want confusion anymore. I didn't want half-truths. I didn't want emotional negotiations. I want stability for my son, I said finally, and clarity for myself. He didn't respond immediately. Because neither of those things depended on him anymore. That night, I made another decision. Not emotional. Practical. I moved into the guest room. Quietly. Without announcement. Daniel noticed, but didn't stop me. And that silence told me we were now officially transitioning into something else. Not reconciliation. Not repair. Separation in progress. But what I didn't know yet was that endings don't just happen between two people. They ripple outward. And soon, everything around us would start responding to what we had already set in motion. The first thing I noticed after moving into the guest room was how loud silence can become when you finally stop pretending. At night, the house felt divided in a way walls couldn't explain. On one side, Daniel stayed in the bedroom we once shared. On the other, I lay awake in a smaller room that suddenly felt more honest than the life I had been living for years. Between us, a hallway that had never felt so long. Ethan didn't question the change. Children accept new arrangements faster than adults do. They adjust first. Then they ask questions later, if at all. He still came into my room in the morning sometimes, climbing into bed with me like nothing had shifted beyond furniture placement. But I could feel it. He was watching more now. Listening more. Processing more. Not fully understanding, but sensing that something important had changed shape inside our home. Daniel and I spoke only when necessary. School, bills, logistics. Nothing personal. Nothing that required emotional language. It was easier that way. Or at least less damaging. But avoidance has a limit. And ours arrived on a Thursday evening when Ethan's school sent another message. This time, it wasn't about behavior. It was about attendance. He had started asking to leave early. Complaining of headaches. Not dramatic enough to alarm at first, but consistent enough to notice. I read the email twice before I said anything. Daniel was in the kitchen when I walked in with my phone. He's not feeling well at school, I said. He looked up immediately. Is he sick? I don't think it's physical, I said carefully. That answer made the room feel tighter. We both knew what it likely was. Stress. Confusion. Emotional spillover from a life he didn't choose, but was now living inside. Daniel rubbed his forehead. We should talk to him, he said. I almost laughed. We should have been talking to him before it reached this point, I replied. He didn't argue. Because there was no defense left, that didn't sound like avoidance. That evening, I picked Ethan up early. He came out slowly, holding his backpack loosely, looking smaller than usual. Not physically. Emotionally. The car ride home was quiet until halfway. Then he spoke without looking at me. Mom. Yes. Are you and Dad mad at each other? My hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. That question. Simple. Direct. No adult layering. Just a child trying to place himself inside a story that no longer made sense. No, I said carefully, we're not mad at you. He nodded slowly. I know, he said. That surprised me. I glanced at him. What do you mean? He hesitated, then spoke softly. I just feel like things are far. That word stayed with me longer than anything else. Far. Not broken. Not over. Just emotionally distant enough to feel unreachable. When we got home, Daniel was already there again. He had started coming home earlier since we moved rooms apart. Not to reconnect, but to be present, as if presence alone could hold things together. Ethan went straight upstairs, and I noticed something different in Daniel's expression as he watched him go. Not guilt, not frustration, something closer to helpless awareness. Later that night, he spoke first. I spoke to a counselor, he said. I turned slightly from the counter, where I was making tea. For Ethan, I asked. He nodded. I think he needs someone outside of us, he said. That was one of the first genuinely responsible things he had said in weeks. But it didn't fix anything between us. It only acknowledged what had already broken. I nodded once. That's a good idea, I said. He leaned against the counter. Then, after a pause, I'm not trying to avoid responsibility here, he said quietly. I looked at him. Because that sentence needed more than words. It needed consistency. I know, I said, but responsibility isn't just decisions, it's time and truth and consequences. He didn't respond immediately. And I realized something else in that moment. He still believed he could participate in repairing this without fully surrendering control. That belief was dangerous, because it slows acceptance and slows healing. The counselor appointment for Ethan was scheduled for the following week. But something unexpected happened before that. A letter arrived. Not an email. Not a message. A physical envelope. Addressed to me. From a law office. My hands stayed still for a moment before opening it. Inside were preliminary documents. Not finalized, but initiated. Daniel had responded to my earlier legal consultation. Not by fighting. Not by denying. But by engaging. Custody discussions. Separation structure. Financial separation planning. It was real now. No longer emotional interpretation. Paper confirmation. I sat at the table for a long time holding it. Not because I was surprised, but because it made everything irreversible in a very physical way. When Daniel came home that evening, I placed the envelope on the counter. He saw it immediately, and didn't pretend not to understand. You received it, he said. Yes, I replied. He nodded slowly. I didn't want it to become chaotic, he said. That word again. Chaotic. As if emotional damage needed to be controlled like logistics. I looked at him. It's already chaotic, I said. We're just documenting it now. Silence followed. Not hostile. Just final in a different way. That night, I heard him sitting in the living room long after Ethan went to sleep. I didn't go down, because I understood something clearly now. We were no longer trying to rebuild a marriage. We were trying to build structure around its ending so it wouldn't collapse on our child. And that required restraint more than emotion. But even with all that structure forming, I didn't expect what happened the next day. Ethan came home from school, unusually quiet. He didn't run to me like usual. He didn't talk about his day. He just placed his backpack down and sat at the kitchen table. I noticed immediately. What happened? I asked gently. He hesitated, then said something I wasn't prepared for. Some kids said Dad is living with someone else. The room went still. I looked at him carefully. Who told you that? I asked. He shrugged slightly. People talk, he said simply. Of course they do. Children always hear things before adults decide they're ready to explain them. I knelt beside him. Ethan, I said softly, listen to me. He looked at me. I chose every word carefully. Adults are dealing with adult situations, I said, and sometimes they make mistakes that affect families, but nothing changes how much you are loved. Not by me, not by your dad. His eyes stayed fixed on mine. But why does it feel like everything is changing? He asked. That question broke something inside me, not loudly, but deeply. Because he was right. Everything was changing, even when we tried to hold it still. I hugged him, longer than usual, not to erase the truth, but to anchor him inside it. That night, after he slept, I sat alone in the guest room again. And for the first time, I didn't think about what Daniel had done. I thought about what we were becoming now. Because whatever this was, it wasn't just a broken marriage anymore. It was a transition into something neither of us had fully learned how to navigate yet. And the hardest part wasn't the ending. It was learning how to keep a child emotionally safe while the ending was still unfolding. The counselor appointment for Ethan arrived faster than I expected. That morning, he woke up unusually quiet again. Not sad, not upset, just subdued. As if he had learned that talking too much lately always led to complicated answers. Daniel offered to drive, but I said I would take him. Not because I was trying to keep distance from him, but because I needed to understand Ethan's world in real time, not through second-hand updates or filtered explanations. The clinic was in a calm part of town. Neutral walls, soft lighting, everything designed to make heavy things feel slightly lighter. Ethan held my hand, tighter than usual as we walked in. Inside, a young counselor greeted us warmly and asked Ethan to come in alone first. I nodded gently to him. He hesitated for only a second before walking in. And then the door closed. That small sound, click, felt heavier than it should have. Daniel was not there yet. It was just me sitting in the waiting room. A room designed for people trying to hold their families together, while quietly accepting that something had already shifted. I stared at the floor for a long time. Not crying, just thinking about how quickly life can move from shared routines to structured separation. From we to logistics. From partnership to planning. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later. He looked tired. More tired than before. Not physically exhausted in the usual sense, but emotionally worn down in a way that no sleep could fix. He sat across from me, without speaking for a moment. Then finally, "How is he?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "He hasn't come out." That was all we said. No arguments. No references to the past. Just two people waiting for updates about a child we had both already impacted differently. After a while, the counselor opened the door. Ethan came out slowly. He looked at both of us, then at the floor. "Can I talk to you?" he asked softly. Both of us stood instinctively, but the counselor gently stopped us. "He asked for one parent at a time," she said. A pause. Then Ethan looked at me. "I want Mom first," he said quietly. Daniel nodded without resistance. That moment mattered more than I can explain. Not because it excluded him, but because it showed where Ethan felt safest when he was uncertain. I followed Ethan into the room. He sat on a small couch, swinging his feet slightly again. A habit he always returned to when nervous. The counselor sat at a distance, giving space. "Do you want to tell me how it went?" I asked gently. He nodded, then hesitated. "They asked me questions," he said. What kind of questions? He looked at his hands. About home, he said. About you and Dad. I stayed quiet, letting him choose the pace. They said it's okay to feel confused, he continued, but I don't like feeling like that. My throat tightened slightly. I know, I said softly. Nobody does. He looked up at me. Are you and Dad going to live together again? He asked. That question. Direct. Simple. No emotional shielding. I took a breath. Because this was one of those moments where pretending would do more damage than truth. I don't think so, Ethan, I said gently. Silence. Not shock. Not crying. Just processing. Then he nodded slowly. Okay, he said. That response surprised me. Because children often accept truth faster than adults expect. They don't always like it, but they adjust to it when it's given clearly. He leaned back slightly. But you're still my mom, he said. Yes, I said immediately. Always. And Dad. That one was harder. Because I had to separate my pain from his reality. Dad loves you, I said carefully, even if things between adults are complicated. He nodded again, then asked something that stayed with me long after. Is it my fault anything changed? I moved closer instantly. No, I said firmly. Never, not even a little bit. He studied my face for a moment, like he needed to confirm it was consistent. Then he nodded. Okay, he said again. When we came out, Daniel stood up immediately. Ethan looked at him, then said softly, I talked to Mom first. Daniel nodded. That's okay, he said. And for the first time, I saw something in him that wasn't defensive. It was restraint, maybe even understanding. The counselor spoke briefly to both of us after, explaining emotional adjustment, stability routines, consistency in communication. Nothing dramatic, just structure. When we left, Ethan was quieter than usual but not distressed. That alone felt like progress. In the car, he fell asleep within 10 minutes, head resting against the window. Small, exhausted, emotionally drained in a way only children can be after learning adult truths too early. At home, Daniel helped carry him inside. We laid him on the couch instead of taking him upstairs immediately. Neither of us spoke much. After that appointment, something subtle changed between us. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, but shared responsibility became more visible. That evening, Daniel stayed in the kitchen longer than usual. I noticed him watching Ethan sleep from a distance. Then he finally spoke. I didn't think it would reach him like this, he said quietly. I didn't respond immediately. Because that sentence carried weight, but not enough accountability. It always reaches children, I said finally, even when you think it doesn't. He nodded slowly, then sat down. For the first time in weeks, he didn't try to defend anything. He just stayed present. Later that night, after Ethan went to bed properly, Daniel didn't go straight to the bedroom. He stayed in the living room. I was in the kitchen when he spoke again. I'm not asking for things to go back, he said. I looked at him. I know, I replied. A pause. I just don't want him to feel like he's losing both parents at once, he added. That was the first statement from him that fully centered Ethan, not himself. And I acknowledged it. Then we keep things stable, I said, even if we're not stable. He nodded. We stood in silence for a moment. Not hostile. Not emotional. Just two people learning how to coordinate a life that no longer fit its original shape. But later that night, something unexpected happened. I found Ethan sitting awake in his bed. He wasn't crying, just awake. I had a dream, he said when I sat beside him. What kind of dream? He paused. Dad was at the park again, he said, but he was alone this time. I stayed quiet. And you were there too, he added. What happened? I asked softly. He looked at me. You were both looking at me, he said, but not together. That sentence stayed with me. Because children don't describe dreams randomly. They reflect emotional reality in symbolic form. He continued. I don't like when people are far apart, he said quietly. I hugged him gently. I know, I said, but we're still here. And as I held him, I understood something more clearly than before. We were not just managing separation. We were actively building a new emotional environment for him to grow inside. And every decision, every silence, every explanation, every moment of distance or unity was shaping how he would understand love, trust, and stability in the future. And that responsibility was heavier than any argument between adults. Because it didn't end when emotions faded. It stayed in him. Long after we were done breaking. The days after the counseling session didn't suddenly become easier. But they became more structured. And structure, even when painful, is what keeps people from drifting completely apart. Daniel started doing something new. He began showing up consistently at Ethan's routines. School drop-offs, occasional homework help, simple presence, not emotional repair, just reliability. At first, it felt strange watching him try to exist inside a version of fatherhood he had partially stepped away from before everything collapsed. But Ethan responded to it. Slowly, carefully, like a child testing whether something stable was real or temporary. I didn't interfere. Not anymore. Because I was also learning something important. That healing wasn't about controlling every moment. It was about building consistency around uncertainty. One evening, while Ethan was doing homework at the kitchen table, Daniel stayed seated across from him longer than usual. I was washing dishes nearby when I overheard something that made me pause. Dad, Ethan asked, do you still work a lot? Daniel hesitated slightly, then answered honestly. Yes, he said, but I'm trying to balance things better now. Ethan nodded, then said something simple. Okay. No resistance. No emotion. Just acceptance of effort. And I realized something in that moment. Children don't demand perfection. They respond to presence. Not explanations. Not promises. Presence. Later that night, when Ethan went to bed, Daniel didn't leave immediately. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, then spoke quietly. He's adapting faster than I expected, he said. I leaned against the wall. Children always adapt, I replied. It's adults who get stuck. He nodded. And then something changed in his tone. I spoke to Honor again, he said. That name still carried weight in the air, even when it was spoken calmly. I looked at him, not with anger, but with awareness. What did you say? I asked. He exhaled. I told her it's completely over, he said again. No confusion, no continuation, nothing. I studied him for a moment, and then said the only thing that mattered. Does she accept that? He paused. A longer pause this time. I don't know, he admitted. That honesty mattered. Because for the first time, he wasn't trying to control every outcome. He was acknowledging uncertainty. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of jealousy. That emotion had started fatting into something more distant. But because clarity doesn't always bring peace immediately. Sometimes it brings awareness. And awareness forces you to see the full shape of what happened. Not just betrayal, but the timeline of it. The repetition. The sustained choices. I thought about the year he had lived another life. About the days I had smiled without knowing. About the dinners. The conversations. The normalcy that had been layered over something hidden. And I didn't cry. Not anymore. Instead, I felt something quieter. Grief that had moved past shock. Grief that was becoming understanding. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Ethan came into my room early. Not panicked. Not upset. Just curious. "Mom," he said, sitting on the edge of my bed, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." He hesitated. "Are you happy here?" That question caught me off guard. Because children don't usually ask about emotional states like that unless they've started observing them. I sat up slowly. "I'm okay," I said carefully. He nodded. Then asked again, "But are you happy?" Silence. Because I couldn't lie to him. And I couldn't give him a burden either. So I chose honesty in a softer form. "I'm working on it," I said. He seemed to accept that. Then added something that stayed with me. "I like it when you're not sad," he said quietly. That sentence wasn't about judgment. It was observation. Pure and simple. I smiled gently. "I'll try," I said. Later that day, Daniel mentioned something practical. "I think we should consider a more structured separation plan," he said while making coffee. I turned slightly. "We already started one," I replied. "Yes," he said, "but I mean clearer timelines, living arrangements, consistency for Ethan." He wasn't wrong. But the way he said it showed something important. He was transitioning from emotional survival to logistical acceptance. And that shift, while necessary, marked the real end of denial. We spent the next few days discussing practical arrangements. Nothing dramatic. Just slow dismantling of shared life into two coordinated parts. It felt like organizing the remains of something that used to feel permanent. One afternoon, while Ethan was at school, I went through old photos. Not out of nostalgia, but because I needed to understand the full arc of what I had lived. There were pictures of us at the beach, birthday parties, holiday dinners, moments that looked complete from the outside. But now, when I looked at them, I saw something else. Not lies, but absence. Small emotional distances that had existed long before I had language for them. And I realized something unsettling. The betrayal hadn't started a year ago. It had simply become visible a year ago. That evening, Daniel came home earlier than usual. He found me sitting with the photos. He didn't interrupt immediately. Just watched for a moment. Then sat beside me. "You're going through them," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. Silence followed. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I don't recognize myself in some of those moments anymore," he admitted. That honesty shifted something between us again. Because it wasn't defensive. It wasn't avoidance. It was reflection. I closed the album gently. "I do," I said. "That's what makes it harder." He nodded. No argument. No correction. Just acceptance. That night, Ethan insisted we all eat dinner together at the table. It wasn't planned. It just happened naturally. 3 plates. 3 people. A familiar setup with an unfamiliar emotional weight. At one point, Ethan looked at both of us. "Can we still do dinners like this?" he asked. Daniel and I exchanged a brief glance. Then I answered. "Yes," I said, "as long as it makes you feel okay." He nodded. Satisfied. And I realized something then. He wasn't asking for family restoration. He was asking for continuity. For predictability. For something that didn't shift unpredictably anymore. And that was something we could give him, even if we couldn't give each other anything else. After dinner, when Ethan went upstairs, Daniel stayed seated for a long time. Then finally said, "We're doing better than I thought we would." I looked at him, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging reality. "We're stabilizing," I said. He nodded, and for the first time, I saw something close to acceptance in his expression. Not of what happened, but of what could no longer be reversed. And as the night settled again, I realized something quietly profound. We were no longer trying to return to who we were. We were learning how to exist responsibly in what was left. The following week brought something I wasn't prepared for. Not another confrontation. Not another discovery. But a kind of quiet stability that felt unfamiliar in a house that had been emotionally loud for so long. Ethan started smiling again. Not fully. Not like before everything happened. But in small ways. On the way to school. While eating breakfast. While telling me random stories about classmates that suddenly didn't carry hidden weight anymore. It wasn't healing yet. But it was relief. And in situations like ours, relief is the first real sign that survival is shifting into something more stable. Daniel kept his routine consistent. School runs when needed. Work during the day. Home at predictable hours. He wasn't trying to be the old version of himself anymore. He had stopped pretending. Instead, he was building something new inside the same life. One evening, after Ethan went to bed, I found Daniel sitting on the back porch alone. The air outside was cool. Quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like it belongs to reflection rather than emptiness. I stepped out slowly. He didn't turn immediately, but he knew I was there. "You're thinking a lot lately," I said. He let out a small breath. "I don't have much choice," he replied. I sat in the chair beside him. For a while, we didn't speak. Just listened to the night. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I met someone at work who went through a similar situation years ago," he said. I turned slightly. He continued. "He told me something I didn't really understand at first," Daniel said. "That you don't fix the past. You only decide what kind of future you stop damaging." That sentence stayed in the air between us. Because it wasn't defensive. It wasn't self-justification. It was acknowledgement. I nodded slowly. "That sounds like someone who learned the hard way," I said. He gave a faint, tired smile. "He did," Daniel replied. A pause. Then he added, "I think I'm still in that part of the process." I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see a man trying to escape consequences. I saw someone slowly learning how to live inside them. Not absolved, not forgiven, but aware. That awareness changed how I interacted with him after that. Not softer, not harsher, just more grounded. Because emotional chaos had been replaced by emotional structure. And structure requires different behavior. The next major shift came from Ethan. His counselor suggested a joint session with both of us. Not because there was another crisis, but because he was starting to ask deeper questions about how things work now. We agreed. All three of us sat in the same room again a few days later. This time, Ethan wasn't nervous, just observant. The counselor asked him first, "What's been better lately?" He thought for a moment. "School is okay," he said, "and Mom and Dad are not yelling anymore." That simple sentence carried more meaning than anything else in the room. The counselor nodded. "And what still feels hard?" she asked. Ethan hesitated, then said, "I don't know where everyone fits." Silence followed. Because that was the most accurate description of our situation anyone could have given. Not broken. Not repaired. Just restructured, without full understanding yet. The counselor looked at us. "Can you both respond to that?" she asked gently. Daniel spoke first. "I'm here," he said, "and I'm trying to be consistent." Then he paused. "I know I wasn't before." That honesty mattered. Ethan listened carefully. Then looked at me. I spoke slowly. "I'm here too," I said, And I will always be your home base, no matter what changes around us. Ethan nodded, then asked something simple but important. So we're still a family? That question didn't have a clean answer, but it had an honest one. Daniel and I exchanged a brief look. Not coordinated, not planned, just understanding the weight of it. Yes, I said gently, but it looks different now. Ethan processed that quietly, then nodded again. Okay, he said. Not happy, not sad, just accepting information he was still learning how to feel about. After the session, Daniel walked ahead to the car while I stayed behind with Ethan for a moment. He looked up at me. Is it going to always feel weird? He asked softly. I crouched down slightly. No, I said honestly. Not always, but sometimes it takes time before something new feels normal. He seemed to accept that, then added something unexpected. I don't like the old normal anymore, he said quietly. That surprised me. I studied his face. Why? I asked. He shrugged slightly. Because I don't trust it, he said. That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. Because it showed something important. He wasn't clinging to the past. He was learning to redefine safety in a different way. That night, Daniel and I spoke again on the porch. But this time, the conversation was different. Less about damage, more about direction. I spoke to a mediator, he said. I nodded. About custody schedules, I asked. Yes, he replied. Then added. I want it structured in a way that doesn't keep shifting for him. That was consistent now. A pattern forming in him. Responsibility, moving from emotional regret to practical action. I agreed. We should prioritize stability over convenience, I said. He nodded. And for the first time, our agreement didn't feel like tension. It felt like coordination. Inside the house, Ethan was asleep. And for once, the silence didn't feel like something breaking. It felt like something settling. But life rarely allows stability to remain untouched for long. Because just when we started adjusting to a calmer rhythm, something external arrived that tested it again. A message from Anna. Not to me. To Daniel. And accidentally forwarded to the family email thread. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. Just a simple line. I hope you're keeping your promise. That was all. But it was enough. Because promises belong to private spaces. And when they appear in shared ones, they reopen everything that was trying to settle. Daniel saw it first. Then I did. He deleted it immediately from the thread. But deletion doesn't erase awareness. I didn't speak right away. Neither did he. Because we both understood what it meant. The past wasn't just something he had ended. It was something still aware of its existence. That evening, he sat in the kitchen longer than usual again. Not defensive. Not confused. Just thinking. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. I don't know if I handled that completely right, he said. I looked at him. You ended it, I said. That's what matters. He shook his head slightly. That's not enough for closure, he said. And that was the first time he acknowledged something deeper. Closure isn't something you declare. It's something that forms when all sides stop expecting continuation. And we weren't fully there yet. That night, I checked on Ethan before bed. He was asleep peacefully. But his hand was slightly curled around the edge of his blanket like he was holding onto something without realizing it. I stood there for a long time, watching him, and I realized something quietly. Our journey wasn't about fixing what we had lost anymore. It was about making sure he didn't inherit the instability we had created. And that responsibility would define every step we took from here onward. The message from Anna didn't cause an explosion in our house. It caused something more complicated. Awareness that the past wasn't fully behind us yet. It lingered in the corners of conversation, in the pauses, in the way Daniel moved a little more carefully around his phone after that. Not because he was hiding anything new, but because he was finally understanding how easily old threads can resurface, even after you think you've cut them. For me, it didn't reopen rage. It reopened clarity. Because closure isn't a moment. It's a process of repeated confirmation that something is truly over. And that confirmation doesn't always come cleanly. The next few days were quiet again, almost deceptively normal. Ethan went to school, came home, did homework, watched TV, laughed at small things again. That kind of emotional leveling out that makes adults start hopping things are getting better. But I had learned something important by now. Better doesn't mean finished. Better just means more stable than before. One evening, Daniel and I had a scheduled meeting with the mediator. A neutral office in a professional building downtown. Everything there was designed to reduce emotion and increase structure. Tables, forms, schedules, agreements. No personal language. Just frameworks. We sat across from each other, with a third person guiding the discussion. The topic was custody arrangement. Week structure. Holidays. Transitions. It felt strange to hear our life reduced to alternating time blocks and calendars. But at the same time, it was grounding, because it removed ambiguity. At one point, the mediator asked a simple question. Is there any possibility of reconciliation being considered? The room went quiet. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Neither did I. Not because we were uncertain, but because the answer required honesty that didn't fit emotional comfort. Finally, Daniel spoke first. I don't think we're in that space anymore, he said. His voice was steady. Not defensive. Just factual. I nodded once. Neither do I added. And that sentence felt heavier than I expected. Not painful in the sharp way it once would have been, but final in a structural way. Like confirming a bridge had already been dismantled. The mediator simply noted it and moved on. No judgment. No reaction. Just progression. After the meeting, we walked out separately, but ended up in the same parking area. For a moment, neither of us left immediately. Daniel leaned against his car. I stood a few feet away. Then he spoke quietly. This feels strange, he said. I looked at him. Yes, I agreed. A pause. Then he added, I never thought it would look like this. I understood what he meant. Most people imagine endings as emotional events. Arguments. Breakdowns. Scenes. But ours had become something different. A slow structural separation, wrapped in continued parenting. Neither did I said honestly. He nodded, then said something unexpected. I'm trying to make sure Ethan doesn't feel like he's choosing sides. That mattered, because it showed where his focus had shifted. From self-management to child-centered responsibility. I'm doing the same, I replied. We stood there a moment longer. Then he left, and I stayed in the parking lot for a few seconds before getting into my car. That night, I noticed something new in Ethan. He was calmer, not just behaviorally, but emotionally, as if he was starting to understand the rhythm of two stable environments instead of one unstable one. He asked a question over dinner. Will I always live in two houses? I looked at him carefully. Probably, I said gently, but both will be your home. He thought about that, then nodded. Okay, he said. No resistance. Just acceptance forming slowly. After he went to bed, I found Daniel already home earlier than expected. He was in the living room, reading something on his phone. But when I walked in, he set it aside. I spoke to Honor again, he said. That name no longer carried shock. Just history. I waited. I told her there's no ambiguity anymore, he continued. No communication, no future contact. I studied him. And, I asked. He hesitated. Then said, she didn't take it well. That was expected. Because endings are rarely mutual in emotion, even when they are mutual in decision. I nodded slowly. And did you hold your boundary? I asked. Yes, he said. That mattered more than emotion now. Consistency mattered. Because consistency is what replaces broken trust in environments where repair is no longer the goal. Later that night, I sat in Ethan's room after he fell asleep, just watching him breathe. And I realized something important. We were no longer in crisis. We were in restructuring. And that shift is subtle but significant. Crisis is loud. Restructuring is quiet. But restructuring determines the future more than crisis ever does. As I stood to leave his room, Ethan shifted slightly in his sleep and whispered something I almost didn't hear. Mom. I paused. He didn't wake up, just turned slightly and settled again. But that one moment stayed with me. Because even in sleep, his mind was still processing the transition of his world. And my role now wasn't to erase that transition. It was to make sure it didn't become instability. It was late when I finally went to my room. Daniel was already asleep. Or pretending to be. I couldn't tell anymore. But for the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel like it was holding its breath. It felt like it was slowly learning how to breathe differently. Not as one unit, but as a coordinated system, adjusting to separation. And in that realization, I understood something quietly important. We were no longer trying to fix what broke. We were learning how to live responsibly inside what remained. The following weeks settled into something I can only describe as structured quiet. Not peace, not happiness, but predictability. And after everything we had been through, predictability felt like a kind of medicine we didn't fully trust yet, but needed anyway. Ethan adapted faster than both of us expected. Children do that when adults finally stop sending mixed signals. He started asking fewer anxious questions, stopped scanning faces for emotional clues as often. And slowly, he began to separate Mom's house and Dad's house in his mind without confusion turning into distress. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Daniel and I coordinated schedules through messages, now instead of spoken negotiations. It made things cleaner, less emotionally charged, more functional. One evening, I picked Ethan up from Daniel's place. He came out holding a small paper model he had built with his father. Dad helped me, he said proudly. That sentence carried something subtle. Connection without tension. I nodded and smiled. That looks great, I said. Daniel stood at the door watching, not inserting himself into the moment, just observing. And I realized something then. He was learning how to exist as a parent without trying to dominate the emotional space. That alone was a shift. On the drive home, Ethan talked about school again. This time, not with confusion or heaviness. Just normal childhood storytelling. And I listened fully for the first time in a while, without feeling like I was interpreting emotional subtext in every sentence. That night, after he went to bed, Daniel and I had another structured conversation. We were sitting at the kitchen table, not facing off, just aligned in logistics. I think we've reached a point where we should formalize everything, he said. I understood immediately. Legal finalization, custody documentation, clear separation boundaries. Yes, I said. No hesitation. Because emotionally, we had already crossed that threshold weeks ago. We were just catching the paperwork up to reality. He nodded. I'll handle my side, he said, then added, I want it to stay as stable as possible for him. That continued to be his focus now. And I respected that. Because regardless of everything that led us here, Ethan's stability had become the shared priority. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Anna called. Not me. Daniel. He told me afterward. He didn't hide it. Didn't soften it. Just informed me directly. She wanted closure conversation, he said. I looked at him. And I said no, he replied immediately. There's nothing to continue discussing. That mattered. Because it showed complete boundary enforcement now. Not partial. Not emotional. Final. She accepted it, I asked. He shook his head slightly. Not really, he said, but it doesn't change anything. And that was the difference now. Her emotional response no longer dictated his actions. That was real closure forming, not as a feeling, but as behavior. That evening, I noticed something in myself too. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel triggered by the mention of her name. Not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer had power over my direction. I was no longer reacting to the past. I was participating in the present structure. Later that night, Ethan asked if we could have dinner together again, all three of us. Not as a reunion, just as a routine. We agreed. And it was calm. Not forced. Not tense. Just simple. Ethan talked about a science project. Daniel helped him remember something from school. I cooked. We ate. And there were no emotional undercurrents pulling the moment apart. After dinner, Ethan went upstairs early. And for a long time, Daniel and I just sat in silence. Then he said something quietly. I think this is what acceptance feels like, he said. I looked at him. Not romantically. Not emotionally. Just understanding the statement. Yes, I said, but it's not the same as peace. He nodded. I know, he replied. Because acceptance is not resolution. It is acknowledgement without resistance. That night, I walked into Ethan's room before sleeping. He was already half asleep. Mom, he murmured. Yes. Are things better now? I paused. Because I didn't want to lie. And I didn't want to burden him with adult complexity. So I answered in a way he could carry. Things are more steady, I said, and steady is what we need right now. He seemed to accept that, and drifted back to sleep. I stayed there a moment longer, watching him breathe, and I realized something quietly important. We had moved out of survival mode. We were no longer reacting to crisis. We were building continuity. The next morning, I got a message from the mediator confirming final documentation steps. Everything was progressing toward legal completion. Not emotionally significant anymore, but structurally final. I didn't feel panic or grief, just recognition. Endings, when handled over time, stop feeling like events. They become processes you gradually finish. When I told Daniel, he simply nodded. Okay, he said. No resistance. No delay. Just agreement. And I saw it clearly then. We had both reached the same place independently. Not together, but parallel. That evening, as I stood in the kitchen alone after Ethan went to bed, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. The house felt different. Not lighter, but less divided. The emotional tension that once filled every room had been replaced with quiet structure. And even though the story of us had ended in its original form, what remained was something new. Not family in the old sense. Not separation in the chaotic sense. But something carefully rebuilt around responsibility. And for the first time, I stopped thinking about what we lost. and started understanding what we were building in its place. The legal process moved faster after that. Once both sides stop resisting emotionally, paperwork has a strange way of becoming simple. Not easy, just clear. Daniel and I signed preliminary custody arrangements first, then living schedules, then financial separation outlines. Each document felt less like a conclusion and more like a confirmation of something already lived. There was no dramatic moment when it felt over. It was more like watching a photograph slowly come into focus until you realize it was already taken a long time ago. Ethan adjusted to the schedule changes better than I expected. Mondays and Tuesdays with Daniel. Midweek evenings with me. Weekends alternating. At first, he would ask small questions before transitions. Will Dad be there when I pack my bag? Can I take my homework to Mom's house? Little checks for emotional safety. But over time, those questions reduced. Because consistency started answering them before he needed to ask. One afternoon, when I picked him up from school, he got into the car smiling slightly. Mom, he said, I told Dad I want to try soccer. That surprised me, because Daniel hadn't mentioned it. That's great, I said. What did he say? He said he'll sign me up, Ethan replied. And that was the shift. Not emotional reconciliation, but cooperative parenting functioning without friction. That evening, I told Daniel. He nodded immediately. I already looked into local leagues, he said. No delay. No debate. Just action. It was strange how quickly cooperation becomes natural when emotional conflict is removed. Later that week, something unexpected happened again. Anna sent one final message. Not to Daniel this time. To a professional contact of his. It was brief. Almost neutral. I hope things are better now. I just wanted closure. Daniel showed me immediately. No hesitation. No secrecy. He didn't respond. He just deleted it. Then blocked further communication paths. I think this is the last of it, he said quietly. I studied him. Do you believe that? I asked. He thought for a moment, then replied honestly. Yes, he said, because I've stopped leaving space for anything else. That mattered. Because closure isn't about what others stop doing. It's about what you stop allowing access to. That night, I sat with Ethan while he packed for Daniel's house. He moved more confidently now between spaces. Less confusion in his movements. More routine. Mom, he said suddenly, are you okay when I'm at Dad's house? That question was new. Not about stability. About emotional presence. Yes, I said gently. I'm okay, and I'm always here when you come back. He nodded, then smiled slightly. Good, he said, and continued packing. After he left the next morning, I stood in the quiet house for a while. Not sadness. Not emptiness. Just stillness. And I realized something important. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't measuring life by what was missing. I was measuring it by what was functioning. That afternoon, Daniel came by briefly to drop off something Ethan had forgotten. We spoke at the door. Nothing emotional. Just logistics. But before leaving, he paused. I think we did the hardest part, he said. I looked at him. Yes, I agreed. We survived the breaking point. He nodded once, then added something I didn't expect. I don't think I would have handled this the same way a year ago, he said. I understood what he meant. Because growth often doesn't feel like transformation. It feels like correction over time. I wouldn't have either, I said honestly. He left after that, and I closed the door. That evening, Ethan returned home happy. Not euphoric. Just comfortable. He talked about soccer practice. About friends. About small normal things that no longer carried emotional weight. And I listened fully. That night, after he slept, I sat alone in the living room. And I finally allowed myself to reflect, not on betrayal, not on anger, but on the full arc of everything. The discovery, the collapse, the structure, the rebuilding. And I realized something quietly powerful. We had not gone back to what we were. We had built something entirely new out of what remained. Not perfect, not romanticized, but functional. And for Ethan, that was enough. And for me, after everything, it had to be enough too. The final stage didn't feel like an ending. It felt like completion of a long transition we had already been living inside for months. The court documents were finalized quietly. No dramatic hearings. No emotional statements. Just signatures, dates, and confirmations that a shared life had officially been divided into structured responsibility. When I held the final copy in my hands, I didn't feel shock or relief. Just clarity. Like something that had been slowly separating for a long time had finally stopped pretending it was still one piece. Daniel and I met one last time with the mediator for a final review. Everything was already agreed upon. Custody schedule confirmed. Financial separation finalized. Communication limited strictly to Ethan-related matters. It was all very clean on paper. Life rarely feels as clean as paperwork suggests, but this was as close as it gets. When we walked out of that office, we didn't linger. There was no emotional speech. No attempt to redefine what we were to each other. Just a shared understanding that the chapter had reached its natural end. Outside, Daniel stood for a moment near his car. He looked at me, not with regret, not with resentment. Just acknowledgement. "We did it the right way in the end," he said quietly. I nodded. "Yes," I replied, "for him." He didn't argue. Because that had always been the unspoken priority, once everything else collapsed. Ethan adapted to the finalized arrangement more smoothly than either of us had expected at the beginning. Children don't need perfect families. They need predictable ones. And that's what we had finally managed to build. A system. Not a broken home. Not a restored marriage. But two stable homes connected through consistent parenting. One evening, when I picked Ethan up from Daniel's house, he ran to me holding a drawing. It showed 3 figures. One labeled Mom. One labeled Dad. And one in the middle. Himself. "Look," he said proudly, "I drew our family." I looked at it carefully. There was no confusion in his expression anymore. No searching for emotional clues. Just confidence in what he understood his life to be. "It's really good," I said softly. Daniel stood behind him, watching. Not interrupting. Just present. That was enough now. Later that night, after Ethan went to sleep in my home, I sat by his bed for a long time. He was breathing peacefully. No tension in his face. No emotional heaviness in his sleep anymore. Just rest. And I realized something quietly profound. We had spent so long fearing the breaking point. But what mattered more was what came after it. Because breaking is not the end of a child's world. Confusion is. Instability is. And we had finally moved past both. When I stepped out into the hallway, the house was quiet. Not empty. Just settled. Daniel's presence in Ethan's life had become consistent and structured. My role had become steady and grounding. There was no overlap anymore that created emotional confusion. Only coordination. And that coordination was enough to hold a child's sense of safety together. Before going to bed that night, I received one final message from Daniel. Not about logistics. Not about schedules. Just a simple line. "Thank you for keeping things stable for him." I stared at it for a moment, then replied, We both did, because that was the truth now. Not partners, not enemies, just co-parents who had learned how to rebuild responsibility from the remains of something that once felt permanent. And as I turned off the light that night, I didn't think about betrayal anymore. I didn't think about what was lost. I thought about Ethan sleeping peacefully in a world that no longer felt uncertain. And I understood something important. Sometimes a happy ending is not about going back to what was broken. It's about building something steady enough that a child never has to feel broken inside it again.